Prologue. Mirror Prison. In the Benerust Plains, in the southeast of the kingdom of Rydil, the ground rumbled. The sounds of large creatures trampling the land and ramming one another with their bulky bodies could be heard as hordes of earth dragons and fire dragons clashed over territory. The earth dragons were bigger and stronger. Their scales were dark brown, their arms and tails as thick as logs. Meanwhile, the fire dragons, with their scales of reddish-brown and orange, were somewhat smaller, with thinner limbs. But they could breathe fire. Neither type could fly, and both were categorized as lesser dragons. But they were still plenty threatening to humans. Currently rampaging in the Benerust Plains were a total of 4 earth dragons and 6 fire dragons. Looking purely at the numbers, the fire dragons held the advantage. But the more powerful earth dragons were winning the day, as they were nearly immune to their enemies' flames. From a human's perspective, however, fire dragons were infinitely more troublesome. Their flames could catch the surroundings on fire, causing even greater calamity. Even now, the flames they used to intimidate their enemies were charring the plains' grasses, raging more furiously by the minute. As the horde of dragons howled and warred amid the spreading fire, a small group of people watched from a little hill overlooking the plains. There were 5 of them, all men wearing deep green uniforms under their cloaks and holding the staffs of high mags. These uniforms marked them as members of the Magic Corps, an elite fighting force that utilized magecraft. Standing at the head of the group was the youngest of the 5, a man in his mid-20s, his chestnut hair tied into a braid and a monocle sitting in front of his right eye. His name was Louis Miller, the Barrier Mage, and he had slender, handsome features that one might even call feminine. This genius mage was the youngest in history to be appointed commander of the Magic Corps. Louis narrowed his eyes behind his monocle and began to speak. Results from the scouting magecraft have been shared and the coordinate axis identified. Preparing to deploy Mirror Prison. Gather all enemies at a single point. Despite the giant dragons raging before him, Louis showed no panic or fear. He delivered his instructions to his subordinates dispassionately and began to chant a spell. He was calm, and yet the corners of his mouth lifted into a smile he couldn't hide. The mags under him let loose attack spells, staggering their strikes to produce a constant stream. Dragons had incredibly tough scales, and unless one struck at their weak spots, the point between their eyes, or the eyes themselves, one's attacks would have little effect. This barrage was meant for another purpose, to distract and direct. As Louis chanted, he stuck the staff in his right hand into the ground. A glowing white magic circle emerged at the staff's tip, and from it, white rays of light stretched toward the ground and sky, forming a large dome. These rays became the frame for a giant, translucent wall. Expanding, it locked the earth dragons, the fire dragons, and the burning plains inside. That should make it easier to stamp out these annoying lizards, he said. His 4 subordinates switched to a different chant, this time firing wind arrows inside the half-sphere barrier enclosing the dragons. Within the barrier, invisible arrows made of compressed air zoomed about. Even if one didn't hit a dragon, it would bounce off the barrier's wall and fly back toward the beasts at a different angle. Louis's barrier wasn't just sturdy, it could reflect mana-based attacks striking its interior walls, hence the name of the spell, Mirror Prison. Most defensive barriers could only parry 1 or 2 enemy attacks at most. It took a considerably talented mage to create a barrier strong enough to trap a dragon, much less one that could reflect magecraft, too. Though his title implied a particular strength in defensive combat, Louis Miller, commander of the Magic Corps, used his barriers more offensively than anyone else. Continue your staggered attacks, Louis ordered the others, fixing his stare on the dragons rampaging inside the barrier. None of his subordinate strikes would be fatal unless they struck the beast's vital areas. The wind arrows were purely to confuse the dragons and to buy time for another chant. You needed a lot of power to finish off a dragon, they were tough as nails and had a lot of life force. Maintaining his barrier, Louis began a slightly longer chant. The words took the mana within him and wove it together, giving shape to a formula. The work was precise, steady, and delicate. In the name of Louis Miller, the Barrier Mage, I command this gate to open." In the center of the domed mirror prison, white particles of light gathered and formed a shining gate. It opened slowly, and wind gusted out of it, filled with glittering, yellowish-green lights. This was grand magecraft. It borrowed the power of one of the great spirit kings, and very few in the kingdom of Riddil could use it. "Come forth from the edge of stillness, Sheffield, king of the wind spirit." A moment later, a storm whipped up inside the barrier. The Spirit King's wind was far mightier than any normal attack spell, forming whirring blades inside the barrier. In turn, the barrier's reflective properties caused these tempestuous winds and their invisible blades to strike at the dragon horde from every direction, while also cutting the burning grass before the fires could spread any further, all in a single breath. One fire dragon staggered into another, and they both toppled over, only for wind blades to rain down upon them. They sliced into the creatures' brows, eyes, and even their mouths, brutally tearing them apart. These winds were much more dangerous and destructive in an enclosed space, especially when they continuously reflected off the walls of the barrier, never losing momentum. Smaller dragons were whipped right off the ground and slammed into the barrier itself. Eventually, the gate silently drew closed. As the storm subsided, Louis dispelled his mirror prison. Holes now dotted the ground where the barrier had stood. Scattered grass lay about, along with the corpses of dragons. Their remains, brows pierced and mangled by the storm, lay awkwardly, one atop the other. Anyone who hadn't seen it happen would have doubted their own eyes. "That should do it," murmured Louis, tapping his staff against his shoulder. He'd locked the dragons into a barrier and slammed them with high-powered magecraft, a tactic that, while incredibly rough and violent, was perfect for confining damage to a set area. That said, it wouldn't have been possible without high technical proficiency in both barrier techniques and attack magecraft. And the one who had done it all so easily was a slender, delicate-looking man who seemed like he belonged in a strategy room giving orders, not on the front lines. The other members of the Magic Corps beheld their young, beautiful, and wicked superior, their hearts filled with fear and awe. This dragon hunt on the Benerust plains was considered extremely difficult, as it involved a horde of earth and fire dragons. It was also highly dangerous. They'd feared a major outbreak of fire and damage to the nearby town. Normally, such a hunt would have called for a much larger party composed of both the Magic Corps and the Dragon Knights. Unfortunately, the Kingdom of Riddle's eastern provinces had been plagued by a string of dragon raids over the past week, and the Dragon Knights, along with part of the Magic Corps, had just left on an expedition headed there. Facing a serious shortage of personnel, Louis Miller had brought a tiny, elite team with him, and they'd slain both types of dragons, kept the fire from spreading, and protected the town. People were eager to praise the Barrier Mage as noble, virtuous, and courageous. They called him the true defender of the realm. At the moment, however, that virtuous, courageous man was in a private room at his lodgings, busily counting his money. Louis went over his bank deposit record, then turned his wallet inside out. Then, as if suddenly remembering, he opened a locked drawer and took out an empty jar of jam. It was filled with large silver coins, 12 of them, to be exact. He sat cross-legged on his bed as he counted up all his money, including the reward for this dragon hunt. "Hell yes," he exclaimed, sounding less than classy. "It's enough." At last, he clenched his fists, his voice filled with joy. "I can buy a house in the capital." Louis picked up a bottle of spirits he'd left next to his bed and swirled the contents around. It was cheap, but he gulped the entire thing down, savoring it, then let out a happy breath. And then I swear I'll become a sage." As he wiped his alcohol-spattered mouth with his hand, his lips parted in an intrepid, toothy grin, revealing his high canines. He'd changed a lot about himself, growing his lustrous hair out long and acting like a refined, sophisticated man. But in truth, he was from an impoverished village in the northern reaches of the kingdom. Dangroats was a village with nothing but the sheer white snow that buried it in winter. In one of its out-of-the-way corners stood a desolate brothel. That was where he was born. This is the story of how a boy raised in a remote, destitute village rose to become one of the 7 sages, the greatest mags in the kingdom of R'dil.